There's a moment near the end of the first season that I keep coming back to. The group is at the CDC in Atlanta. They found warmth, hot water, wine, the first real meal in weeks. And upstairs, everyone is celebrating in a way that feels almost unbearably ordinary. People are laughing, Shane is playing ping pong, Glenn is getting quietly drunk. It looks for one brief hour like something resembling a normal life. And downstairs, in a corridor, Dr. Edwin Jenner leans close to Rick Grimes and whispers something. Something we don't hear. Rick's face in that moment isn't fear. It's quieter than fear. It's the expression of someone who has just been handed a weight they're not sure how to carry. Jenner's hand rests on the door. The countdown hums in the background. Upstairs, someone laughs. What did he say? And here's the question I want to sit with tonight. Does knowing it change everything? Let's start at the beginning of The Secret, because I think The Secret itself tells us something important about how this show thinks about truth. The episode is the 6th of the first season, titled TS-19, named for a test subject Jenner had been studying in the months since the world ended. He's the last man standing at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. Everyone else either left or chose to die rather than keep going. He's been running the facility on emergency power, watching the generators drain, talking to himself and to the cameras, and to whatever remains of his scientific methodology in a world where the normal rules of scientific methodology have completely broken down. He's not doing well. You can see it in the way he moves through those corridors. Purposeful on the surface, hollowed out underneath. When Rick leads the group through the CDC's doors, Jenner lets them in partly because it's the right thing to do, and partly, I think, because he's been alone for so long that even the company of strangers feels like oxygen. He gives them food, wine, hot showers. He shows them TS-19's brain scan, the mapped reanimation process, the virus lighting up the dead tissue, the second death of whatever the person was. He answers their questions with the careful, exhausted honesty of someone who no longer has the energy for comfortable lies. And then right before everything ends, before the building's going to destroy itself, he takes Rick aside and tells him something privately. We find out what it was in the third season's finale, Welcome to the Tombs, when Rick finally tells the rest of the group. It's this. Everyone is already infected. Every living person carries the pathogen. The bite doesn't transmit the disease. The disease is already there, systemic, dormant until death. When you die, however you die, you turn. The bite kills through sepsis, through bacterial infection, through wound trauma. But the turning happens regardless of the cause of death. Rick knew this for 2 full seasons before he told anyone. Think about what that means. He carried that information through the farm, through the prison's early days, through Laurie's death, through the long siege of the winter. He made decisions, led people, watched people grieve losses they didn't fully understand, all while holding this specific truth quietly in the back of everything he did. The show withholds information the way its characters do. Not carelessly, not for cheap suspense, but because the act of withholding is itself meaningful. Rick doesn't tell anyone because he genuinely doesn't know what to do with a truth that has no corresponding action. You can't infect yourself. You can't protect people from something already living inside them. The truth, in that specific context, is a weight with no lever attached to it. It can only be carried, not used. The question that sits underneath this entire theory is a simple one, but I think it opens outward in every direction. What do you do with a truth you can't fix? Rick's answer was to keep moving, keep it close. Jenna's answer was to stay in the building until it burned. The franchise, across all its seasons and spin-offs, keeps returning to that same question. And the answers keep changing. and none of them are entirely satisfying, and maybe that's exactly the point. Why does Rick sit on this for 2 full seasons? I think quietly, because telling people would mean proving to them that there is no ground beneath their feet at all. That every strategy they've built, every caution they've practiced, is operating on a false premise. And Rick needs them functional. He needs the group to have enough hope to keep getting up in the morning. That's a morally complicated choice, and it's one worth thinking about as we move forward. Let's talk about the biology of it, because the show is actually more careful about this than it sometimes gets credit for. The core revelation, everyone is already infected, reframes every death we'd seen in the first 2 seasons, and every death we'd see after. It means that the bite was never the original horror. The original horror was already there, already carried in the blood of every person trying to survive, every child being protected, every person who fell asleep at watch and trusted someone else to keep them safe through the night. The clearest confirmation of this comes in a series of deaths spread across the show's middle seasons. Laurie Grimes dies in the prison during childbirth. She's not bitten. She doesn't survive long enough to be attacked. And she turns. Merle Dixon, after being killed by the governor early in season 3, turns in a field without a bite having anything to do with it. Characters throughout the series who die from blood loss, from illness, from accidents, from violence that has nothing to do with walkers, they turn. Every time without exception. The rule is absolute and it doesn't negotiate. This is a detail that the show dramatizes most quietly, but it's one of the most important things it establishes. The walkers are not the disease vector. They're a symptom. They're what the disease looks like once it's had time to work. The actual threat, the thing that cannot be avoided, cannot be escaped, cannot be outrun no matter how fast you move or how well defended your community is already inside every person you love. Think about what that does to the emotional texture of the show's survival logic. All the walls, all the watch rotations, all the careful security protocols the communities build over the years. Alexandria's reinforced fences, the hilltop's compound walls, the sanctuary's perimeter. They're protecting against a very real external threat, but they can't protect against the thing that's already internal. The communities fall, when they fall, mostly from the inside, from betrayal, from disease, from leadership collapse, from the accumulated cost of decisions made under impossible pressure. The walkers are often the proximate cause, but the structural failure is almost always human. This makes the infection, in my reading, less a biological fact and more a thematic one. The show is telling us, in the language of science fiction, that the apocalypse isn't something that happened to humanity from outside. It's something that humanity is carrying. Every person is both survivor and potential threat. Every death is also a conversion. The thing you're trying to protect your people from is, in a very literal sense, indistinguishable from your people. Carol Pelletier understands this better than most characters in the franchise, not because she's studied the biology, but because she has looked, unflinchingly, at what survival actually requires, and she hasn't turned away from it. She knows that every person in her community is a potential walker. She factors it into her decisions in ways that other characters struggle to. That calculus produces some of the show's most morally uncomfortable moments, including her actions in the prison's early season 4, when she makes choices about the sick that she doesn't ask permission to make. Are those choices monstrous? Or are they the logical endpoint of truly accepting what the infection means? I don't think the show wants to answer that cleanly. And I think that discomfort is exactly what the biological reality of the virus is designed to generate. The enemy isn't out there, beyond the fence. The enemy turns with your face. It walks in your clothes. It reaches for the people it used to love with hands that don't remember loving. If the threat is already inside every single person you're trying to keep alive, then what exactly are you fighting for? I think the show's answer, offered quietly and consistently across 12 seasons, is this. You're not fighting the infection. You're fighting for the time before it wins. You're fighting for the life that happens in between. And that distinction between defeating the threat and honouring the time is everything. There's a detail about Jenna that I think gets lost in the drama of the CDC episode, and it's one I keep returning to because it reframes the whole setup of our theory. TS-19 is not just a test subject designation, it's Jenna's wife. Her name was Candice Jenner. She was also a scientist or a researcher who, in the early days of the outbreak, volunteered to be infected so that the data from her turning could be studied properly. She believed right up until the end that the scientific process was the best available tool for finding a way through. She donated her death to the work. What Jenner has in that CDC building is not just the most detailed study of a reanimation ever conducted. It's a recording of his wife's brain activity as she died and became something else. He's watched it more times than he can count. He watches it again for the group. The bloom of electrical activity at death, the long silence, the slow reactivation in the brainstem, the walk arising from what was a person. And he describes what's being lost in clinical language, while clearly feeling every second of it, in a way that has nothing to do with science. It's a person, he tells them, up until those last moments. He says it carefully, like someone who has been trying to hold that thought in a specific shape and finding it harder and harder to do. The Walking Dead has a consistent and quietly devastating pattern when it comes to scientists and researchers. They're never saviors, they're always tragic. Jenna at the CDC, the scientist at the Primrose facility in World Beyond, the researchers the CRM maintains, not to save humanity based on what we learn through the spin-offs, but to serve the organisation's own particular vision of what a rebuilt world should look like. Every scientist in the franchise who has tried to find an answer has either given up, been consumed by their methodology, or been co-opted by something more powerful than their research. This pattern feels meaningful to me, and not in a cynical way. I think the show is being honest about something genuinely true. The scale of the problem is beyond the tools available. Jenner isn't a failure. He's a person who did rigorous work under conditions that made rigorous work almost impossible. Who got close enough to the truth to map the reanimation, but not close enough to interrupt it? He found the shape of the disease without finding its name. And then he decided that was as far as he could go. The data he had at the end was real and significant. The virus is present in all living hosts. Reanimation follows death regardless of cause. The brainstem reactivates while the higher functions remain dark. He'd mapped the what with precision. He hadn't found the why, the where it came from, the how to stop it. And here's the thing that I think sits beneath all of this. Jenner burns the building not because he's given up on humanity, but because he genuinely believes there's nothing left to find. He's a scientist, and his conclusion, based on the available evidence, is that the evidence has run out. He offers the group the option to stay, to go peacefully as he plans to, because he believes that mercy is the honest gift at this point. Rick refuses. The group refuses. They go back out into the world with the secret and the weight, and the continuing belief that the time between now and the turning is worth something. That belief, stubbornly against all available evidence, is what the franchise spends the next decade following. Was Jenner the end of hope? My honest feeling is no. I think he was the end of a specific kind of hope. the institutional kind, the government-funded laboratory kind, the kind that requires electricity and equipment and an orderly civilization to support it. But he handed something to Rick in that corridor. Not just the information, the responsibility. The weight of being the person who knows and has to decide what to do about it. And that weight, carried quietly through 2 seasons, becomes one of the most important things the show does with its main character. The lit window of the CDC when it finally explodes is not an ending, is something else. Somewhere still has the lights on. Here's something the show shows you but doesn't always draw attention to. Not everyone turns at the same speed. This is a canon observation that spans the entire run of the franchise, and it's one of those details that seems like background texture until you start paying attention to it. Some people reanimate within minutes of death. Others take longer, sometimes significantly longer, long enough that the people around them aren't immediately sure what's happening. The variation is real and consistent, and the show never offers a confirmed explanation for it. Tyrese Williams dies in season 5 and is turning within what appears to be a relatively short span of time, though the episode handles his final moments with deliberate visual ambiguity. Herschel Green is killed in season 4's mid-season finale, and his reanimation, while not shown in real time, is implied to happen quickly. But there are other deaths where the window feels longer, where characters have time to say things, to make choices, to be present in a way that the biology should arguably be curtailing. What does the variation mean? There are a few possible readings, and I want to be careful here about the line between observation and theory. The most straightforward reading is that the variation is individual. Different immune systems, different physical conditions, different amounts of stress, hydration, injury at the time of death. This is the most medically plausible interpretation, and it's probably the one the show intends at a practical level. People aren't identical, and so their deaths and their reanimations aren't identical either. But there's a more interesting reading sitting just underneath that one, and it's the reading that starts to connect to everything we'll be exploring later in this theory. If the virus is already present in every host, dormant, waiting, then the speed of reanimation might reflect something about the relationship between the host's biology and the pathogen. Some people carry it in a state of deeper dormancy. Some are closer to the threshold. The variation might not be random noise in a uniform process. It might be evidence that the virus and the human biology it inhabits are in a more dynamic, ongoing relationship than a simple presence and waiting model would suggest. That's speculative territory, and I want to name it clearly as such. There's no confirmed canon explanation for reanimation timing variation, but the variation itself is documented across enough episodes that it's worth noting as an observable pattern. And observable patterns, in a show as carefully constructed as this one, are usually worth following. What strikes me most about this variation from a character standpoint is what it means for the people watching someone die. The uncertain window, the not quite knowing how long you have before the person you love becomes something else, is one of the most persistent sources of emotional horror in the franchise. It means every deathbed is also a clock. It means every goodbye is also a logistical calculation. It means the people left behind have to hold love and readiness simultaneously, in proportions that shift with every passing minute and can never be calibrated in advance. Think about Glenn watching Maggie's father die. Think about Rick holding Laurie in those final episodes of season 3. Or rather, not being able to hold her, arriving after the fact, finding only what she left behind. The emotional devastation of these moments isn't just grief. It's the specific grief of a world where death and transformation are continuous, And you can't stop to mourn in the old way, because the body of the person you loved is still moving, still converting, still becoming something you have to respond to. The virus, whatever its origin, whatever its mechanism, has taken something fundamental from the survivors: the right to sit with loss. And that theft, quiet and biological and unconditional, shapes everything about how these characters relate to each other while they're still alive. They hold on harder. They say things sooner. They love with a kind of urgent, compressed intensity that normal life rarely produces, because normal life allows you to believe you have time. Is the variation random? Or is something else at work? I don't know, but I find myself thinking it matters more than it initially appears, and that's where the pattern starts to click. Or at least, it might. Let's talk about what a bite actually does, because I think this is one of the places where the show's science is more grounded than people sometimes realise. The reason a walker bite kills is not the virus. We know this now. The virus is already there. The bite kills because a walker's mouth is one of the most biologically hostile environments imaginable. Think about what a walker is. A body in advanced decay, operating without the immune system processes that normally regulate bacterial growth, with rotting flesh and decomposing organic matter concentrated in and around the teeth and gums. The bite introduces a massive load of bacteria directly into the wound, bacteria that a living immune system, already under extraordinary stress from survival conditions, simply cannot contain. This is sepsis. Bacterial infection entering the bloodstream through a wound and overwhelming the body's defences faster than treatment can respond, especially without antibiotics, without sterile environments, without the medical infrastructure that would normally make such an injury manageable. Herschel loses his leg in the prison early in season 3 after being bitten, and the amputation works not because it removes the virus, but because it removes enough of the infected tissue quickly enough to prevent the sepsis from spreading through the bloodstream. That's real emergency medicine applied to a fictional, biological context. The show's being honest about the mechanism. What this means practically for the survivors is that the bite is dangerous for the same reason that any deep puncture wound from a contaminated source would be dangerous in a world without functioning hospitals. It's not magic, it's not supernatural transmission. It's the compounding tragedy of a world where the things that would normally save you, antibiotic, surgical intervention, sterile dressings, are gone. Herschel Green is, in many ways, the franchise's clearest embodiment of this particular truth. He starts as a veterinarian, someone whose medical knowledge is adjacent to human medicine but not identical. And he becomes, across seasons 3 and 4, the prison community's doctor by necessity. He understands the biology better than most characters, and that understanding makes him both more useful and more burdened. He knows why people die. He knows with clinical precision what's happening when someone doesn't make it, and he carries that knowledge with the same quiet weight that he carries everything, with faith, with attention, with a refusal to look away from the cost of what's happening. There's a line he delivers in season 4's 5th episode, Internment, when the prison is caught in the grip of a respiratory illness that's killing people faster than the group can contain it. He's moving from cell to cell, doing what he can with almost nothing, and he tells someone, quietly, in the way Herschel says everything, that you can't just stop. You step outside, you risk your life. You drink water, you risk your life. You breathe, and you risk your life. Every moment now, you don't have a choice. The only thing you can choose is what you're risking it for. That line matters enormously to this theory because it reframes the biology of the virus in exactly the way I think the show intends. The infection is not the enemy. The infection is the condition. The enemy, the thing actually worth fighting, is the passivity, the surrender, the decision to stop choosing. Herschel keeps moving from bed to bed not because he believes he can cure what's killing people, but because he believes the moving itself is a form of defiance. The choosing matters, even when the outcome is uncertain. This is the emotional truth underneath the science of the bite. The horror of it isn't that it's a death sentence. In a world without antibiotics, a lot of things are death sentences. The horror is that it's a reminder, physical and visceral, and impossible to ignore, that the body you're living in is already compromised, already carrying the thing that will eventually convert it. The bite just accelerates what was always coming. It makes the invisible visible. It forces the reckoning that the dormant infection has been quietly postponing. The bite was never the curse. The world was, and the survivors have been trying, episode after episode, season after season, to build something worth living in inside that curse. Not despite it, but with full knowledge of it. That's not nothing. That might in fact be everything. There's a scene at the very end of World Beyond's second season that I want to spend some time with, because I think it's one of the most quietly significant things the franchise has done with its virus mythology. And it happens in a post-credit sequence that a lot of viewers might have missed. A French scientist, a woman working in what appears to be a research laboratory in France, is watching a video recording of another scientist. The tone of the interaction is hostile. She's angry in the specific way that someone is angry when they believe a colleague has made a catastrophic mistake. She talks about variant proteins. She implies without stating outright that whatever happened with the virus was not random, that there was a specific point of origin, a specific failure, and that the collapse of civilization may trace back to a place and a decision that can be identified. This is as close as the live-action franchise has ever come to pointing at an origin, and crucially, it doesn't complete the point. It opens a door and leaves it open. What the scene confirms or strongly implies is that the virus has been changing. The term variant proteins suggests a pathogen that is not static, that has been mutating, adapting, producing new configurations as it moves through hosts and time. This is biological behaviour that real viruses exhibit. And the show, by using specific scientific language in a scene clearly designed to be taken seriously, is signalling that this isn't just flavour text, it's a direction. The emotional weight of this scene is different from most Walking Dead moments because it shifts the frame. For 12 seasons of the flagship show, the virus was a fixed and unknowable background condition. The sky, not the weather. It was there, it wasn't going to change. The communities the survivors built were being built on the assumption that the rules of the world, however horrible, were at least stable. World Beyond's post-credit scene suggests the rules might not be stable, that someone, somewhere, had been watching the virus do something it wasn't doing before, that the world the survivors had been learning to live in might be slowly, subtly, becoming a different world. Someone, somewhere, still has the lights on. That's the thing I keep coming back to. After the CDC burns, after the Primrose facility falls, after every institutional attempt to study and understand the pathogen seems to collapse, someone is still in a laboratory, still running tests, still watching what the virus does with the focused attention of a scientist who hasn't given up yet. The question of whether that continued study is a source of hope or a source of new danger is one the franchise is clearly not ready to answer cleanly. Some fans in the community have read the World Beyond post-credits as direct evidence of a manufactured origin, a lab that created or modified the virus and lost control of it. Others read it as evidence of institutional failure that predates the apocalypse, something that went wrong in the ordinary chaos of scientific research, long before anyone understood the scale of what was happening. Both readings are consistent with the scene. Neither is confirmed. What both readings share is the suggestion that the virus has a history, that it came from somewhere, was shaped by decisions, and is now following a path that might still be influenced by what humans do next. That's a very different kind of horror than an unknowable plague descended on humanity. It's the horror of consequence, the horror of something built going wrong. Is the virus evolving? And does that change the rules of survival? If the world beyond post-credits is the franchise opening a door, then the Daryl Dixon series in France is the first thing we see through it. And what we see through it is something the survivors have never had to face before. Something that doesn't behave the way they were taught to expect. Daryl Dixon in France is a man thoroughly out of context, which is part of what makes his encounter with the variant walkers so interesting to trace. He's been travelling through a France that looks, feels, and operates differently from the American apocalypse landscape he knows. The social structures are different, the survivor communities are different, the geography is different, and he's navigating a world where his hard-won instincts, the reflexes built over more than a decade of survival that have kept him alive through more close calls than most people experience in a lifetime, are still mostly valid, but occasionally, crucially, wrong in ways he doesn't immediately understand. The variants are the clearest example of this wrongness. In the Daryl Dixon series, walkers in France exhibit behaviour that departs meaningfully from the baseline the survivors established in America over the course of the flagship show. They're faster in bursts. They respond to stimuli with more apparent purpose. There are moments where their behaviour reads as something closer to reactive decision-making than the simple stimulus-response pattern the survivors learn to predict and exploit. They're not intelligent. That distinction matters, and the show is careful about it. But they're operating with a kind of efficiency that the standard walker does not. This is not a dramatic upgrade. The show doesn't present variants as a sudden, overwhelming new threat that makes everything the survivors know useless. It presents them as a shift, a change in degree that, under certain conditions, becomes a change in kind. A single standard walker, confronted by an experienced survivor, is a manageable threat. A group of walkers that moves with slightly more coordination, responds slightly faster, adjusts slightly better to unexpected obstacles. That changes the calculus. Not catastrophically, not immediately, but in the slow and compounding way that small biological changes tend to matter. Daryl's crossbow is one of the motifs I keep returning to in his spin-off. It's his signature, his most trusted tool, the thing that has been with him longer than almost any other single object in the franchise. He maintains it the way people in his position maintain the things they depend on, carefully, habitually, with the kind of attention that isn't really conscious anymore. And there are moments in the France series where you see him recalibrate, where the crossbow and the instinct behind it are almost not enough. Where something he expected to be slow is faster than expected, and the difference is small, but the difference is real. The franchise has a consistent pattern of expanding its mythology through the spin-offs, rather than the flagship show. The original series established the rules. The spin-offs are now exploring what happens when the rules start to bend. World Beyond opened the door with the post-credits scene. Daryl Dixon in France shows what's on the other side of it. And if the variants in France are the result of the virus mutating, if the changes in walker behaviour are downstream of changes in the pathogen itself, as the variant protein language from World Beyond implies, then the gap between what the survivors know and what the world is becoming is quietly widening. Daryl is alone in a foreign country, surrounded by communities he doesn't fully understand, facing walkers that don't fully behave the way his decade of experience told him they would. And he keeps going. He adjusts. He recalibrates his crossbow arm and his angles and his expectations, and he keeps moving, because that's the only thing he knows how to do that has ever worked. But here's what I find myself wondering. When Daryl eventually returns, and the franchise trajectory strongly suggests he does, what does he bring back with him? Not just the emotional weight of everything he found in France, the information, the knowledge that what he encountered over there is different from what people are managing at home, the specific hard-won understanding that the walkers he knows and the walkers that may be coming are not the same. If walkers can change, what else about the virus might still be changing? The franchise doesn't have an answer yet, but it's asking the question in a way that feels, to me, like it's building towards something. And that's where we begin to trace the theory. Before we go further, I want to spend a chapter being honest about something, because I think honesty is part of what makes a theory worth exploring. The origin of the virus in The Walking Dead is, by design, unknown, not accidentally unknown, deliberately, intentionally, philosophically unknown. Robert Kirkman, who created the original comic series that the television franchise is built on, addressed the question of origin explicitly in the back matter of the comic books and in various interviews over the years. He has said more than once that he never intended to reveal the origin, that the mystery is not a gap waiting to be filled, but a choice, a deliberate removal of the explanation so that the story has to live entirely in the aftermath. This is worth taking seriously. It means that when we theorize about origin, when the community speculates about lab accidents, about a natural mutation in an animal reservoir, about a manufactured pathogen that someone lost control of, we're building on a foundation that the creator intentionally left open. That's not a criticism of the theorizing. I think it's part of what makes this universe so richly collaborative. But it means we're working in territory that canon has not, and may never, fully map. What the live-action franchise has added to Kirkman's intentional vagueness is, specifically, the world beyond post-credits scene and the Daryl Dixon variant storyline. These are canon additions that the television universe has made independently, expansions of the mythology that weren't in the comics at that point, more specifically than the comics ever did, toward France, toward a laboratory, toward the language of mutation and variant proteins. The television franchise appears to be more interested in approaching an explanation than the comics were. Whether it will actually arrive at one is genuinely uncertain. Fan theories about the origin occupy a wide and interesting spectrum. Some community members believe the post-credits scene confirms a lab origin, that someone in a French research facility either created the virus or modified a natural pathogen in a way that accelerated the apocalypse. See, others believe the scene is pointing at a natural mutation that happened to be first identified in France, with no human culpability involved. Still others believe the franchise will continue to use the origin as a background mystery, perpetually suggested, never confirmed, because answering it would fundamentally change the show's emotional register. I find myself drawn to that last reading, honestly, not because I don't want to know. I do, the way you always want to know the thing you've been wondering about for years, but because the uncertainty is doing real narrative work. It's keeping the apocalypse from being reducible to a single decision, or a single failure, or a single person. It's keeping it vast and impersonal and beyond any one individual's capacity to fix, which is exactly the kind of horror that produces the kind of characters this franchise cares about. Characters who don't know why the world ended, but who decide to live in it anyway. Characters who can't fix the source of the problem, but who build communities and grow food and raise children and maintain watch rotations in the dark. Characters who carry the weight of an unexplained catastrophe and choose day after day to carry it standing up. Is the mystery the point, or is the answer coming? Genuinely, I think it might be both. I think the franchise is slowly moving toward more explanation, while preserving the emotional texture of the mystery. The post-credits scene in World Beyond, the variants in Daryl Dixon, these feel like the show learning to talk about origin without fully committing to an answer, testing the temperature, seeing how much explanation the story can absorb without losing the thing that makes it matter. What do you think? Is the mystery worth protecting? Or are you ready for the franchise to finally name what happened? I'd genuinely love to know where you land in the comments, because this is one of those questions where the community is meaningfully divided, and I think both positions are honest responses to what the show has built. For now, let's follow the thread the franchise has given us and see where it leads. Here's where the theory starts to take shape, and I want to lay it out carefully because it's built on a chain of observable patterns rather than a single confirmed fact. The World Beyond post-credits scene establishes that someone with scientific knowledge believes the virus has undergone a meaningful change, that variant proteins are present, that behaviour is different, that something has shifted from whatever the original pathogen looked like. The Daryl Dixon series confirms, in visual canon, that Walker behaviour in France is different from Walker behaviour in the American outbreak zone. These two data points, one spoken, one shown, are, to my reading, the franchise signalling a specific possibility. The virus has been mutating since the initial outbreak, and the variants are the visible evidence of that mutation. If this reading is correct, and I want to hold it gently as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the implications for the survivors are significant in a way that the franchise is only beginning to explore. The survival knowledge that the communities have built over the past decade plus is, in many ways, extraordinary. It was built through loss, through terrible trial and error, through the deaths of people who figured out the wrong answer so that the people after them could figure out the right one. Alexandria's walls, the Hilltops community structure, the careful protocols around the dead that every community eventually develops. This is institutional knowledge, passed down and refined, representing an enormous collective investment in understanding the specific threat they face. But if the threat is changing, if the virus is producing new variant behaviour in Walker populations, and if that behaviour is spreading or shifting the baseline of what a Walker means, then some portion of that hard-won knowledge is becoming less reliable, not useless, not immediately obsolete, but eroding at the edges in ways that could matter at the worst possible times. Think about the difference between knowing that a Walker moves at a certain speed and finding one that moves faster. Think about the difference between knowing that a Walker responds to sound and finding one that responds to something more. The margin of error in encounters that the survivors have calibrated over years of experience is built on a specific set of behavioural assumptions. Shift those assumptions even slightly, and the margin of error shifts with them. My guess, and this is firmly in theory territory, grounded in the pattern rather than in confirmed future storytelling, is that the franchise is building toward this tension as a structural element of its next phase. The world the survivors have learned to live in, and the world the virus is slowly becoming, are drifting apart. The gap is small enough to be invisible until it isn't, and the moment it becomes visible, the moment someone's hard-won knowledge fails them at a critical point because they were applying rules to a world that has quietly changed the rules, is the kind of story beat this franchise does very well. Daryl, having encountered the variants in France, becomes an interesting figure in this reading. He's one of the few survivors who has direct, embodied experience of what the changed version looks like. He knows in the specific and non-theoretical way that only comes from surviving an encounter that the walkers he saw in France are not the walkers he grew up fighting. What he does with that knowledge when he returns, who he tells, how seriously they take it, whether the communities have the infrastructure to adapt to new information about a threat they thought they understood, is a question the franchise hasn't answered yet. What if the group's hardest won knowledge is slowly becoming wrong? I keep returning to that question because I think it's the most emotionally resonant version of the mutation hypothesis. It's not just about faster walkers or more coordinated walkers as a tactical threat. It's about the cost of discovering that experience, the thing you paid for in grief and loss, and the deaths of people you loved, has a shelf life, that the world keeps changing underneath you no matter how carefully you've learned to read it. That's a specific kind of loss, and this franchise knows exactly how to honour that kind of loss. Let's look at the longer arc of walker behaviour across the franchise, because there's something here that I think the theory can use. In the earliest episodes of the original series, back in the pilot in the first few episodes of Season 1, walkers exhibit behaviour that the later seasons quietly move away from. The clearest example is Morgan's wife Jenny. In the pilot episode, she comes to the door of the house where Morgan and his son are sheltering and tries the doorknob. She reaches for it with purpose and turns it with what reads, "in that moment," as intentional problem solving. It's one of the most unsettling images in the early show, precisely because it suggests that something remains. Some procedural memory, some residual connection between the walker and the life that preceded it. The franchise never fully commits to this as a consistent rule. Walkers in later seasons don't generally demonstrate this level of behavioural complexity. The doorknob moment remains somewhat anomalous, a detail from the early show that the mythology didn't fully develop. Some fans read it as early series tonal experimentation that was later adjusted. Others read it as evidence that walkers do retain some faint procedural memory of significant emotional locations and habits. The show also shows clearly and consistently across its run that walkers degrade over time. Physical decay is progressive and undeniable. The walkers of later seasons are measurably more deteriorated than those of the early seasons, which is both a practical visual choice and a logical consequence of the biology. Bones weaken, flesh rots further. Old walkers become, in many ways, less physically capable than newer ones. But here's where the theory gets interesting. The variants in Daryl Dixon are not old walkers that have somehow become more capable despite decay. They're walkers that seem to have been shaped differently from the beginning. Walkers whose behaviour reflects a different relationship between the pathogen and the host at the point of reanimation. Two things, in other words, are happening simultaneously in the franchise's walker population, if this reading holds. Older walkers are degrading, becoming physically less threatening as time passes, slower and more fragile. And newer walkers, at least in some regions, are reanimating with different behavioural profiles, products of a pathogen that have been mutating across the years of the outbreak. The world isn't just ending in this reading, it's becoming something new. The walker population, across the years and the geography, is not uniform. It's not a static threat that will eventually resolve itself through physical decay. It's a changing one, with pockets of something new appearing in places and communities that might not be prepared for the difference. Carol Pelletier, who has arguably thought more carefully about the mechanics of survival than almost any other surviving character, has a line in season 10 that I think belongs somewhere in this theory. She tells someone, with the specific quiet authority she carries in her later seasons, that the world doesn't get easier. It just gets different. She says it in the context of community survival and personal loss, not in the context of walker biology. But I think it applies to both. The world doesn't get easier, the walkers don't go away. And if the pathogen that makes them is changing, if the variants in France are evidence of a mutation that has been working its way through the pathogen for years, then the communities that have learned to survive in one version of the threat are quietly, without knowing it, building skills for a world that is becoming something else underneath them. Are walkers becoming something the survivors have never had to plan for? I think the franchise is strongly suggesting yes, and I think the emotional weight of that answer is the cost of time itself. Every year of survival is also a year of the virus continuing its own quiet, indifferent process. Every community built on hard-won knowledge is also a community that has to stay curious, has to keep watching, keep adjusting, keep questioning whether the rules they've learned still apply. That's not pessimism. In the Walking Dead universe, the people who stay curious are almost always the ones who survive long enough to matter. Let's talk about the cure. Not because one exists, it doesn't, not in any confirmed canon, but because the question of it keeps surfacing in ways that tell us something about what the franchise believes is at stake. Jenna had the question and couldn't answer it. The scientists at the Primrose facility in World Beyond were working towards something. The CRM's research program was pointed, at least in part, at understanding the pathogen well enough to do something about it. What exactly the CRM wanted to do with that research is one of the more morally complex questions the spin-offs raise. The organization's vision of a rebuilt civilization is not neutral. It has priorities, hierarchies, a specific idea of who deserves to survive into the next version of the world. The research program in that context is not simply science in the public interest. It's science in the service of a particular kind of power. This matters for the cure question, because it means that even if someone, somewhere, developed a meaningful intervention, something that could stop the turning, or prevent the reanimation, or address the pathogen at a level that changed the rules, the question of who controls it, who gets access to it, and what conditions are attached to that access would be at least as complicated as the science itself. Rick Grimes understood this in his own way, without the formal framework. His entire arc across the original series is about building communities that are governed by shared values rather than by force, that offer belonging based on contribution and care rather than on compliance. The CRM's model is almost the inverse, a community of survivors selected for capability and governed by necessity, with the research it funds pointed toward a future that looks, from the outside, more like control than like liberation. The Ones Who Live, the miniseries that brings Rick and Michonne back together, engages with this directly. Rick has been inside the CRM's orbit for years. He's seen how the organization works, what it believes, what it's willing to do to protect its vision of rebuilding. And the question the series keeps asking, in different ways, is whether you can build a good future inside a flawed framework. Whether the research and the resources and the genuine long-term thinking the CRM does can be separated from the violence and the hierarchy and the specific cruelties that maintain it. I don't think the show answers that question cleanly, and I don't think it's supposed to. But the question of the cure, the question of whether the pathogen can eventually be addressed, lives inside that larger question. Because a cure, or even a meaningful treatment developed and controlled by the CRM would not be a gift to humanity. It would be a tool of a very specific kind of power, and the survivors who have spent years building something more democratic, more human, more genuinely communal, would have to decide what to do with that. My theory, and this is speculation grounded in the patterns rather than in confirmed future storytelling, is that the franchise is not moving toward a clean cure that ends the apocalypse. It's moving toward a partial answer, something that changes one aspect of the problem without solving the whole thing, something that gives the survivors more options while forcing them to grapple with the cost of who provided those options and what is owed in return. If a cure meant rebuilding civilization from scratch, would the survivors want it? I've been turning that question over for a while. I think some of them would. I think Judith, growing up in Alexandria, having inherited Rick's hope and Michonne's determination, would want it with everything she has. I think Daryl, having seen what France looks like, having seen that the world is bigger and stranger and more varied than any of them understood, would want it quietly, in the way Daryl wants things, without saying it directly but being willing to go very far to get there. And I think there are people who would be afraid of it. Not afraid of the cure itself, afraid of what it would require them to give up. The communities they've built, the knowledge they've paid for, the specific version of the world they've learned to live in, with all its horror and all its strange grace. Who decides? That question might be the most important one the franchise is building toward. I want to offer a counterpoint here, and I want to give it real weight rather than just mentioning it as an obligation. Robert Kirkman made a deliberate, creative choice. The origin of the virus in the Walking Dead universe is not a gap waiting to be filled. It was designed to be open. The story was never about the virus, it was always about what people do after the world ends, about the communities they build and the ones they destroy, about whether humanity is worth saving once you've seen what humanity is capable of. The virus is the condition, not the subject. And there's a real argument to be made that explaining the virus, even partially, even through the language of variants and post-credit scenes and French laboratory hints, makes the story smaller rather than larger. When the apocalypse is caused by a specific lab accident or a specific scientific failure, it becomes something that could, in principle, have been prevented. It becomes a result of specific human decisions rather than an impersonal force of nature. And that shift changes the emotional texture of everything that came before. The survivors in the original series are not survivors of a preventable disaster. They're survivors of something that simply happened. Something as vast and impersonal as a weather event. Something that doesn't care about their goodness or their effort or their love for each other. Their heroism is meaningful precisely because it's in response to something that has no meaning. They're building significance in a world that stopped providing it automatically. That's the specific kind of courage the show is interested in. If the apocalypse was caused by a laboratory in France, then the heroism is still real, but it's shadowed differently. It's survival after human failure rather than survival after impersonal catastrophe. The moral weight distributes differently. Someone becomes responsible. Someone becomes culpable. And the story, which has always been careful to avoid making any one person the source of the world's problems, has to contend with the possibility that the world's problems had a beginning that could be pointed at. Some fans in the community take exactly this position. That the mystery is the point, that explaining it would be a mistake, that the best version of the franchise's future leaves the origin question exactly where Kirkman left it. Open, vast, and unanswerable. They argue that every step toward an explanation is a step toward a different kind of story, and not necessarily a better one. I think they're right about something important. The emotional power of this franchise, the reason people are still watching, still theorizing, still caring about these characters more than a decade in, is not located in the virology. It's located in Rick choosing hope when the evidence argues against it. It's in Daryl maintaining his crossbow with the same care he gives to the people he loves. It's in Maggie making impossible decisions about the future of communities she didn't create and can't protect alone. It's in Judith wearing a hat that belonged to a father she barely knew and carrying it forward anyway. Does explaining the virus make the story richer or smaller? I find myself genuinely uncertain. I think the franchise can do both, can gesture toward explanation while keeping the emotional mystery intact, if it's careful. The world beyond post-credits and the Daryl Dixon variants feel, to me, like the show being careful, pointing without arriving, opening doors without walking through them. But I hold that reading loosely, and if you feel like the mystery is the most important thing, if you're in the camp that wants the origin question left unanswered, that believes the unknowing's where the power lives. I think that's a completely honest and faithful response to what this universe has built. Some questions matter more as questions than as answers. That might be true here. And the fact that we can have this conversation, that the community is divided in a way that reflects genuine care for the story's integrity, rather than impatience for resolution. That's its own kind of testament to what the franchise has made. What do you think? Leave it open or follow it to the source? I'd love to know where you land. Come back to the corridor with me. It's the first season's 6th episode. The CDC is counting down, the emergency power is draining, and upstairs the group is trying to decide whether to stay or go, whether the building's clean death is preferable to the road's uncertain one. And downstairs, in the space between one decision and another, Jenna leans close to Rick and says the thing that changes everything is, we've spent this whole exploration tracing what that whisper means, not just as information, but as a transfer of weight, as a choice that Jenna made in his final hours about who should carry the knowledge and what carrying it might mean for the people still trying to survive. And I keep coming back to the lit window. The CDC, when it goes, takes the most concentrated scientific infrastructure of the early outbreak with it, takes TS19's data, takes Jenna's accumulated months of work, takes the last institutionally supported attempt to understand the pathogen and find a way through it. The explosion from a distance must have looked like every light going out at once. But somewhere the window was still lit, somewhere in France, in a laboratory that the post-credits scene shows us only briefly, and in shadow, someone had continued the work. Someone had kept the generators running, the equipment functioning. The careful observation of a virus that was continuing to do what viruses do, continuing to move through hosts, continuing to change, continuing to become something slightly different from what it was the year before. The world beyond post-credits is, to me, the show's quiet acknowledgement that the window Jenna represented was never the only window, that the work continued, imperfectly and in fragments, and without the infrastructure that would have made it most effective, but continued. Someone was watching. Someone was keeping records. Someone noticed the variant proteins and understood that what they were seeing was significant, even if they couldn't yet articulate all the implications. That's a different kind of hope than the hope the original series trades in. Not the hope of building communities and raising children and growing food inside the ruins, but the slower, quieter hope of scientific patience. The hope that says, The problem can be understood. The problem has a shape. If we keep watching long enough, we'll learn enough about the shape to do something about it. Both kinds of hope are real. Both come with real costs. The hope the survivors have built their communities on requires constant vigilance, constant loss, constant rebuilding after each collapse. The hope the scientists are pursuing requires a different kind of endurance. The willingness to keep doing painstaking work in conditions designed to make painstaking work almost impossible, without knowing if the results will ever matter in time to help anyone you love. Rick Grimes carried Jenna's secret for 2 full seasons. He carried the knowledge that everyone he was protecting was already carrying the thing they were being protected from. He carried it not because he wanted to lie to them, but because he knew, in the way experienced leaders sometimes know, that some truths are only useful when there's something to do with them, when the knowledge can translate into action, when the weight has somewhere to go. By season 3's finale, Welcome to the Tombs, he finally puts it down. He tells them, and the group's response, quiet, complicated, absorbing, is not the collapse he might have feared. They receive the truth the way people receive truth they have already sensed without naming, with grief, and with the specific kind of relief that comes from finally having words for something you've been feeling for a long time. The virus was always there, inside all of them. Every person we've spent 12 seasons caring about. Every child raised inside these communities. Every leader carrying their quiet, impossible burden. The question was never how to stop it. It was always, what do you do with the time you have left? And the answer the franchise keeps giving, in every season and every spin-off, and every character who puts down their grief long enough to plant something, or build something, or love someone, is this: you use it. You use every hour of it. You build what you can build, and you hold what you can hold, and you keep the window lit, even when you're not sure anyone is watching. Maybe especially then.